December 17, 1895. President Grover Cleveland stands before the United States Congress to deliver a message that will shake the world. He announces that if Great Britain does not back down from a border dispute in Venezuela, the United States is prepared to resist by every means in its power. In diplomatic language, that means war. The British Empire, the most powerful force on earth, is being threatened with military action by a nation it still views as an upstart republic. This is the moment the torch of global power began to pass from London to Washington, and it all started over a patch of jungle nobody cared about. If you are sensing this forgotten crisis reveals the birth of American dominance, hit that subscribe button now, because what happened next changed the world forever. The dispute between Venezuela and Great Britain had dragged on for decades. It dated back to the Napoleonic Wars, when Britain acquired the colony of British Guiana from the Dutch. The Dutch had never defined the western border because nobody cared about the dense rainforests of the Orinoco Basin. It was a green hell of swamps and jaguars, impenetrable and economically worthless. But empires abhor a vacuum. In 1841, the British government sent a surveyor named Robert Schomburgk to map the colony. Schomburgk drew a line that pushed the British boundary far to the west, claiming the mouth of the Orinoco River, the commercial artery of Venezuela. The Venezuelans protested. They pointed to old Spanish maps showing their territory extending to the Essequibo River. Britain ignored them. Venezuela was weak, racked by civil wars and coups. Britain was the master of the world. The dispute simmered for 50 years. Then came the gold. In the late 19th century, prospectors discovered massive gold deposits in the disputed territory. The largest gold nugget ever found, weighing over 500 ounces, was pulled from that mud. A gold rush began. British miners flooded the zone. The British government formalized its claim and pushed even further, claiming an additional 33,000 square miles. Before we reveal how this triggered a war crisis, smash that like button if you are realizing gold always changes everything. For Venezuela, this was an existential threat. The British were threatening to take control of the Orinoco Delta, which would strangle the Venezuelan economy. Venezuela was desperate. They severed diplomatic relations with Britain in 1887. They appealed to European powers for help, but nobody wanted to offend London. Venezuela had one card left: drag the United States into the fight. The Venezuelan government hired a former American ambassador named William Scruggs as a lobbyist. Scruggs was a master of propaganda. He wrote a pamphlet titled British Aggressions in Venezuela, or the Monroe Doctrine on Trial. He distributed it to every congressman, senator, and newspaper editor in Washington. His argument was simple: Britain was violating the sacred Monroe Doctrine. The Monroe Doctrine, declared in 1823, stated that the American continents were not subjects for future colonization by European powers. For 70 years, the doctrine had been largely theoretical. The U.S. Navy was too small to enforce it. But Scruggs' pamphlet landed in Washington at the exact moment the United States was looking for a fight. President Grover Cleveland was politically besieged. The economy was in ruins. Strikes and riots swept the country. His party was losing ground. Cleveland needed a win. His Secretary of State, Richard Olney, was a corporate lawyer with a bulldog temperament and deep belief in American exceptionalism. He looked at the Venezuela dispute and saw a test. If Britain could redraw the map whenever it found gold, the Monroe Doctrine was dead. It meant the United States was not the paramount power in its own backyard. In summer 1895, Olney drafted a diplomatic note to the British government. It became one of the most aggressive documents in American diplomatic history. Olney did not just ask Britain to arbitrate. He lectured them. He wrote that the United States is practically sovereign on this continent, and its fiat is law. Think about those words. Its fiat is law. It was a breathtaking assertion of power. Olney was telling the British Empire that in the Western Hemisphere, the United States was the supreme authority. The note landed on the desk of British Prime Minister Lord Salisbury. Salisbury was a bearded aristocratic giant who viewed the United States as a culturally inferior upstart. He read Olney's note with amusement and irritation. He dismissed its arguments as legal nonsense. The Monroe Doctrine, he correctly noted, was not international law. It was just a unilateral American declaration. Salisbury made a fatal error. He decided to ignore the note. He went on vacation. He assumed the Americans were blowing off steam for domestic consumption. 4 months passed. The silence from London was deafening. To Cleveland and Olney, that was a calculated insult. Finally, in late November, the British reply arrived. Salisbury meticulously dismantled Olney's arguments. He lectured the Americans on history and law. He stated flatly that the Monroe Doctrine did not apply to a boundary dispute. He refused arbitration. He refused to budge on the Schomburgk line. The tone was polite, but the message was clear. Mind your own business. When Cleveland read Salisbury's reply, he was furious. He felt personally disrespected. The British had treated the United States like a child that needed schooling. Cleveland decided to escalate. On December 17, 1895, he sent his special message to Congress. He asked Congress to create an American commission to investigate the border. That sounded reasonable. But then came the kicker. Cleveland declared that once this commission determined the true border, it would be the duty of the United States to resist by every means in its power any British appropriation of lands belonging to Venezuela. The reaction in the United States was explosive. Congress erupted in cheers. Republicans and Democrats united against the old enemy. The press went wild. Headlines screamed, "War with England." The Civil War generation, which remembered British sympathy for the Confederacy, felt vengeful patriotism. The Irish-American community was ecstatic at the prospect of fighting the British. In New York, Boston, and Chicago, crowds gathered to sing patriotic songs. Militia regiments began to drill. War fever swept the land. Americans were eager to prove they were no longer a second-rate power. In London, the news arrived with shock. The British public had been paying almost no attention to Venezuela. Suddenly, they opened newspapers to find the American president threatening to invade Canada and sink the Royal Navy. Lord Salisbury met with his cabinet. The mood was grim. They had underestimated the Americans. As admirals ran the numbers, a war with the United States looked terrifying. Yes, the Royal Navy was larger, but ships were scattered globally. To fight America, they would concentrate the fleet in the Atlantic, leaving the empire naked in Asia and the Mediterranean. The Americans had advantages no other enemy possessed. They were uninvadable. The British Army was tiny compared to American manpower. Canada had a thousands-mile border with the U.S. that was impossible to defend. If war broke out, American troops would march into Montreal and Toronto within weeks. Furthermore, Americans had terrifying industrial capacity. They could build ironclads faster than British shipyards. But the most immediate threat was financial. On Wall Street, the threat of war caused panic. On Black Friday, the stock market crashed. British investors holding billions in American railway stocks rushed to sell. The City of London sent a clear message to government. A war with our biggest trading partner will bankrupt us. The British elite stared into the abyss. They were isolated. In Europe, the German Kaiser was growing belligerent. In Africa, the Boers were arming. In the Far East, Russia and Japan were rising. Britain had no allies. Splendid isolation now looked dangerous. Salisbury faced the most difficult decision of his life. Stand his ground and plunge the world into cataclysmic war over mosquitoes and gold dust, or swallow his pride and bow to American demands. Then came the miracle. On January 2, 1896, the German Kaiser sent a telegram congratulating the Boers on repelling a British raid in South Africa. The Kruger telegram was a bombshell, a direct diplomatic insult to Britain. The British public spun around in fury. Anger toward Washington evaporated, replaced by hatred for Berlin. For Salisbury, this was a gift. The German threat was real. The American threat was manageable. Britain could not afford to fight Germany and America simultaneously. Salisbury seized the opportunity to de-escalate. In February 1896, Britain agreed to the primary American demand. They would submit the Venezuela border to neutral arbitration. This was the blink. After months of saying never, they submitted. They accepted the American Commission. They accepted the premise that the United States had the right to intervene. To save face, British diplomats insisted settlers who had lived there 50 years could stay. The Americans, eager for victory without war, agreed. It was a fig leaf covering British retreat. But everyone knew what happened. The Monroe Doctrine had been enforced at gunpoint. The arbitration panel that met in Paris in 1899 awarded Britain nearly 90% of the disputed territory. The Schomburg Line was upheld. Britain got the land, but the United States got the hemisphere. The specific border location did not matter. What mattered was the precedent. Britain acknowledged it could no longer act unilaterally in the Americas. Washington was the Supreme Court of the Western Hemisphere. This marked the beginning of a profound shift known as the Great Rapprochement. The British ruling class realized the Victorian era of effortless dominance was over. They decided the United States was the one power they could not defeat and therefore must befriend. Over the next decade, Britain quietly liquidated strategic assets in the Western Hemisphere, handing them to the United States one by one. In 1901, they signed the Hay-Pauncefote Treaty, giving the U.S. exclusive rights to build and control the Panama Canal. Britain asked for nothing in return. They gave away the most strategic waterway of the 20th century. The 1895 crisis was the moment the torch passed. The British Empire looked into the eyes of the American Republic and saw its own future. A nation with more steel, more coal, more people, and more money. And it made the rational choice to step aside. They lost a continent, but kept their existence. And in the ruthless game of empires, survival is the only victory that counts. If this revealed the forgotten moment America became a superpower, subscribe. Hit that like button and let me know in the comments, was Britain wise to surrender, or should they have fought? Join us as we uncover the power shifts that shaped our world. Thank you for watching.